Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello, and welcome to this special edition of the Way to Wow shows. I'm your host, Kevin Bemel, and we are here every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Normally on Mondays is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly, but today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It also happens to be Inauguration Day. And so as I do on all federal holidays, I do a special show to mark the occasion. And it is interesting. I was just listening to a little bit of the report of the inauguration, and evidently one of the things that President Trump is vowing to do is to release the records related to the assassination of Reverend King. And, there is still speculation to this day that there were others involved besides, I'm going up on his assassin's name, James Earl Ray. And indeed, if that is the case, it is, long past time for we as Americans to know, what really happened. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So I think, for someone of my age, so I was a child when Dr. King was assassinated, but I was old enough to at least be in the kind of the gestalt of the times. Again, I was listening to this report about the inauguration a few minutes ago, and the person observed that people have sort of misdirected Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. He was first and foremost one of the great civil rights leaders of from the middle of the 20th century, if not the greatest. For someone of my age, I can't think of anybody who comes to mind bigger. Certainly not President Lyndon Johnson, who signed the legislation, but could not in any way, shape, or form be considered a civil rights advocate. Nor could his predecessor, John Kennedy, who was infamous for excluding Sammy Davis Jr. From his from the official inaugural party, even though Sammy Davis Jr. worked tirelessly on the campaign to elect Jack Kennedy. And in fact, and I've spoken about this before, to his credit, Frank Sinatra, who was also a huge Kennedy supporter and supported him during his election, pretty much broke with Kennedy at that point over what he felt was an absolutely disgusting slur of his very longtime friend and Sammy Davis Jr. So, Dr. King was really the heart and soul of the 1950s, 1960s civil rights movement, and I think is rightly honored with a day to recognize his contribution to our country. What I think is not very well known is really the part of his life before he got involved in the civil rights movement. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. I think it's important for us to understand the roots and the upbringing of the people who have changed our country, especially who have changed it for the positive, as in the case of Martin Luther King, and to have a sense of who these people are, what their roots are, and I think that also then helps us keep in perspective what we may be able to do. And I think that Martin Luther King Jr.'s life is a testament. He was not a child of privilege by any means, and yet he had one of the greatest impacts on this country and perhaps the world of any American who's ever lived. I don't think that's hyperbole. So Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929. You will notice that that is just prior to the stock market crash of 1929. And so as a small child, he lived through the Great Depression that was not caused by, but that um, occurred shortly after the stock market crash. I will say that my father was born in 1932, and my mother, I won't tell you when she was born because she may watch this and then she'll hit me. But my father was, only 3 years younger than Dr. King, and so in that sense. That's kind of how I relate to him. He was of my parents' generation, what is sometimes called the sandwich generation or the overlooked generation, because they were too young in general to fight in World War II, and yet they lived through it. And that is certainly the case with my mother and father. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. Okay, his father was a reverend, very prominent minister, and Alberta Williams King, who was a teacher. So they grew up in a very tight knit middle class family in the Sweet Auburn neighborhood of Atlanta, which was at the time a thriving center of Black culture and businesses during the era of segregation. So, Martin Luther King Jr. Did not grow up with the silver spoon in his mouth. He had an older sister, Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel, who was known as AD. So he was a middle child. I guess I can relate to that. I'm a middle child myself. But he was also, I think, fortunate to grow up in an intact family with a father and a mother, both of whom were respectable people and worked hard. And that is unfortunately not the case for so many children these days. So from a very young age, King was exposed to the racism, the injustices of this time in American history. He saw segregation firsthand. Okay, if you're not particularly familiar, he would not have been able to eat in the same restaurants as white people. He would not have been able to use the same drinking fountains, the same parks. Okay, everything was separate. Schools were separate, and he was at one time he was told that he could not any longer play with some of his friends because they were white and he was black, and that was not acceptable. And as you can imagine, a child that left a very deep impression on him. And I think obviously understandably so, but it left an impression that I think set the tone for what his life became. So he was strongly influenced by his father, who was a fiery preacher in the mode of the times, and also a civil rights advocate. And his father really instilled in Martin Luther King Jr. the necessity of standing up against injustice. His mother, who was a college-educated woman, which was very unusual for a Black woman at that time. So she nurtured his intellectual and his emotional development. So you can see that his parents had a very profound impact on who he became. So from the standpoint of schooling, Martin Luther King Jr. was very smart. He skipped 2 grades and he entered Morehouse College in Atlanta when he was 15 years old. So he was a very, very bright young man. Now, Morehouse College is an historically black college. It was founded in 1867 in Atlanta, Georgia. So he stayed in his hometown to go to college. Morehouse was founded, as you can see by the date, just a couple of years after the end of the Civil War in 1965. It was, a Reconstruction era institution that was formed to educate newly freed African American men. Over the years, Morehouse has become one of the most prestigious historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. And it's known for its emphasis on developing leadership, character, and academic excellence. And it retains that reputation to this day. It was an all-male institution. And during this time, that was not at all unusual. I know today the idea of single-sex colleges rankles, but there are very good reasons for having them, and I think that it's probably been, frankly, a mistake to do away with them. The sexes learn differently, and interactions among the sexes can oftentimes detract from what are other very important goals of college and university education, such as academics and such. So, but in any event, Morehouse is an all-male institution, and it has produced a number of notable alumni, including Howard Thurman, filmmaker Spike Lee, and former mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. So Martin Luther King Jr. was not the only famous alumni or alumnus, I should say, from Howard University. So after graduating from, or after, as he's working his way, I should say, through Morehouse, I think there was pressure brought on Martin Luther King Jr. To follow in his father's footsteps as a minister, but he really kind of resisted that. It wasn't, at least initially, what he wanted to do. But after a period of self-reflection, he decided to embrace the calling, as it's often expressed in Christian circles. And he was inspired to use the church as a platform for social change. Now, he was not the only one looking in that direction. The Catholic Church was also entering a period of change where it became an avenue for societal changes. If you've ever seen an absolutely delightful movie, Where Angels Go, Trouble Follows, the underlying story to that is the changes facing the Catholic Church in starting in the early 1960s, and how that impacted in particular, in the movie, it's Catholic education, but in general, the church more broadly. And so this was a somewhat of a social trend that was going on, and Martin Luther King Jr. decided to follow in that trend. So while he was at Morehouse, he was influenced by the college's president, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who was a theologian and an outspoken advocate for racial equality. Dr. Mays became a mentor to King and really helped him shape and form his moral and ethical framework. So in the end, Martin Luther King Jr. Graduated from Morehouse in 1948 with a degree in sociology, and then he went on to get a Bachelor of Divinity degree from the Courier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania in 1951. So it's now post World War II, and the Reverend King has finished his schooling and is now embarking on his career, so to speak. During his seminary years, he was exposed to the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi, better known as Mahatma Gandhi, but Gandhi always preferred being referred to as Mohandas Gandhi, and the idea of nonviolent resistance. This was the hallmark of Gandhi's actions against British imperialism in India, and it was with Gandhi's leadership, although not solely through him, that India became an independent country, and did so in a way where there was actually not nearly as much violence as there would have been had not Mohandas Gandhi preached his belief in nonviolent resistance, and that's I'm not going to get it further into that. That's a whole nother story. But the Reverend King adopted that ideal, and it served him very, very well. It helped him gain the sympathy and support of more and more Americans as he developed his movement. So he really rose to prominence for his advocacy of nonviolent resistance to racial segregation and injustice. And he first gained national attention as the leader of the Montgomery bus strike in 1955 and 1956 that was sparked by Rosa Parks being arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. Rosa Parks is sometimes been misportrayed. She was a very intelligent woman. She knew exactly what she was doing. It was in fact an instance of nonviolent resistance. She was there on the bus essentially on purpose to spark the outrage of the whites who didn't think she should be sitting in the front of the bus, basically, and basically wanted to get herself arrested in order to arouse wrath is the wrong word. Arouse the spirits of her fellow Black Americans, as well as sympathetic white Americans to this injustice. Shortly after that, in 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and it really became the vehicle through which he pursued civil rights for the rest of his life. So among the people involved with the SCLC were, as I mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph David Abernathy. He was a very close confidant of Martin Luther King, and he was instrumental in the lead in the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was a key leader of the SCLC throughout the civil rights era. Bayard Rustin was not actually a formal co-founder. He was more of a strategic advisor, and he was among the people who introduced King to the ideas of nonviolence. But he played a significant role in organizing the initial meeting and the shaping of the SCLC. Fred Shuttlesworth, another founding member of the SCLC. He was a fiery minister of the day in Birmingham, Alabama, which was really one of the major flashpoints of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. And he led major campaigns for civil rights, including those targeting segregation in Birmingham. And as someone who has ties to Birmingham, it's I think a sad a fact of history that Birmingham remains infamous, for what happened there. Although now, as someone who's been a visitor to that city many times in the 21st century, the harmony between blacks and whites is really, I think, quite admirable from what I saw. Now, I'm an outsider, so you take that for what you will. Joseph Lowry, another early supporter and eventual leader of the SCLC, contributed to its early formation and its long-term success. And finally, Ella Baker, who was an experienced activist. She played a very critical role in bringing leaders together for the initial meeting that helped establish the SCLC. And so, again, Dr. King was not alone. He had many people helping him, but he was really sort of the charismatic leader of the SCLC and hence the civil rights movement. So the first meeting of the SCLC took place on January 10 and 11, 1957. It was held at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where King was co-pastor. It had a different name originally. I'm going to read the name here. I've got it in my notes. The Southern Leadership Conference on Transportation and Nonviolent Integration. So you can see why they changed the name. That's a pretty laborious one to be speaking out. And also it would be the SLCTNI. It doesn't really, roll off the lips like the SCLC. So as president of the SCLC, King led, numerous civil rights campaigns, including the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington in 1963, and the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965. And of course, at the March on Washington, he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which I'm going to read in a few minutes, if I can get through it without tearing up. So. There were, King won major victories in the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, enshrining in federal law that which had been, made constitutional amendments post-Civil War, but were being undermined by segregationists. In justice to Southerners, we tend to think of segregation as being purely a Southern, as in Southeastern phenomenon. That is not the case. Segregation happened in many, if not most, parts of the United States in one form or another. In New York City, which you've probably heard of Harlem and the Cotton Club. Harlem was the place where Blacks lived. By and large, they did not live in white neighborhoods. Here in Los Angeles, you can buy houses in certain areas and you will still find racial deed restrictions that do not permit the houses to be sold to Blacks, Jews, and I think Chinese. Now, those deed restrictions are preempted by federal law, so they have no effect as a matter of law. But segregation was not solely a Southern U.S. phenomenon. It was throughout the United States. Nor, by the way, was the Ku Klux Klan, which also is thought to be something relegated just to the former Confederate states. That's not at all the case. Indiana, Iowa, many Midwestern states had branches of the Ku Klux Klan, and so the civil rights laws were needed to overturn segregation and voting, denial of the right to vote, and other forms of discrimination throughout the United States. And that is what the Reverend King was able to accomplish. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there supporting a strike by sanitation workers. After a 2-month international manhunt, James Earl Ray was captured. I'm going to recommend this book, Hellhounds on His Trail. So this is a book by one of my favorite authors, Hampton Sides. If you may not be able to see it here, he also wrote Ghost Soldiers and Blood and Thunder. I've read those books as well. Hampton Sides is a fantastic historian, and this book, Hellhounds on His Trail, the electrifying account of the largest manhunt in American history. It details the last few months of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, as well as the international manhunt conducted by the FBI under the supervision of J. Edgar Hoover, who, if you know anything about history, was no fan of the Reverend King, to say the least. He spied on him and absolutely despised him. And yet, as fate would have it, he was responsible for capturing the assassin of Dr. King. So this is an absolutely fantastic book. I will put a link to it in the show notes. If you've never read anything about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, but you're curious, and I hope this show does make you curious, I would recommend starting with this book. It is a wonderful book, very exciting to read, but filled with the tragedy of the events, and it explains many things. Or it helps explain many things that have since transpired in the civil rights movement. So again, Hellhound on His Trail. It will be an affiliate link as always, and you'll see it says paid link next to it, which I'm required to disclose. So Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established in order to recognize, first of all, the contribution of Dr. King to America, but also to recognize the principles under which he operated, which are equality, justice, and the nonviolent resistance to injustice and to a lack of equality that he pursued in order to gain the ground that he did gain. And so that is why here in the United States we honor Martin Luther King Jr. And as I said in the beginning, I think absolutely rightly so. I'm going to be reading Dr. King's the speech he gave at the March on Washington. The March on Washington happened on August 28th, 1963. By the way, I'm using the text from this book, The American Reader, edited by Diane Ravitch. If you are at all interested in the words and documents that are essential to the founding of our country, you will not find a better compilation than Diane Ravitch's book. You can see how used this book is on my part. I've had it for a long time. It's stained and bent because I refer to it many times. Now, the speech is best known for the "I have a dream" phrase, and that's fine. But there is much more in the speech than that. And so I am going to read the entire speech because I think it's crucial to understanding the Reverend King's legacy on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So here we go. And by the way, you'll notice he starts out with words that echo the Gettysburg Address, the famous speech that Abraham Lincoln, known as the Great Emancipator for signing the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War, the Gettysburg Address starts out 87 years ago, 87 years ago, right? You'll hear that echoed here in Dr. King's speech. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, we must face the tragic fact that the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society, and he finds himself an exile in his own land. And so we have come here today to dramatize an appalling condition. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men would be granted the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is not time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make the promise of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment and to underestimate the determination of the Negro. The sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening. If the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new military, which has engulfed, the marvelous new militancy, which has engulfed the Negro community, must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I have a dream. I have a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day the state of Alabama, whose governor's lips are presently dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, will be transformed into a situation where little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and girls and will walk together as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith with which I return to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful sympathy of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land where my father died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountain side, let freedom ring." And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hills of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous peaks of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountain side, let freedom ring. When we let freedom ring, we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." It's not the first time I've read Dr. King's speech. It's always makes me very emotional. As I mentioned in the beginning, I lived through the 1960s as a child and the 70s as a child and a teenager. I remember watching TV programs that, especially in the context of the day, felt that they were making expressions of the hope that Martin Luther King Jr. expressed in this speech. One in particular that comes to mind that may sound silly was an episode of The Partridge Family, where they're sent to do a concert date, and their date gets confused with that of a black performer, and it's the episode stars Richard Pryor, and they need to earn money, otherwise an institution is going to close. And Shirley Partridge essentially stands up and says, whatever we can do, we will do. And Keith Partridge and Richard Pryor, his character, they sit down to write a song that they perform at a street festival in order to raise the money that's necessary to keep this institution alive. And the image of blacks and whites working together was very powerful. And I could see where you might think again that that's kind of silly. It's just a TV show, but it was part of the spirit of the time that people really wished to see blacks and whites, and as Dr. King said, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, really come together for the sake of bettering the lives of all Americans. I dare say we've made some progress since Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. We have farther to go, always. We'll never be perfect. There'll always be opportunities to improve. But I hope that, as I hope I hope you will take inspiration from Dr. King's life, from his words, on this, the day that a new president of the United States is inaugurated, that we will head into a new time for all Americans to work together for our mutual benefit, that we will reduce the rancor and open up our ears to listen to each other. I remember when President Trump was elected the first time. Shortly thereafter, I was sent to Germany. I was by the United States Navy. I was sent there to what's called relief, take the place of another chaplain who was going home. She was a black female chaplain, and she had been badly treated by one of the other officers at the unit, and we had opportunity to talk about that. It was frankly disgraceful, the way she had been treated, and we became friends. I'm proud of that friendship to this day, and one of the things she was able to explain to me was why, at least at the time, many Black Americans were so offended by President Trump's election slogan, "Make America Great Again." To me, that sounded like a worthwhile goal. And she said to me that for many Blacks, they didn't feel that America was great, that America had consistently denied them their rights as citizens, their right to economic opportunity, etc. And I remain very grateful to her for helping me see that perspective. I can understand why people whose predecessors were discriminated against, and who may still feel that they're discriminated against, either by being kept in substandard schools or being denied job opportunities, whatever it is. These things still happen in our country. I can understand why they would find it at the very best troubling, this idea of "Make America Great Again." But no, but I'm very glad she was able to bring that perspective to me, and my introduction to that unit was not particularly smooth because I was so incensed on how she had been treated. And we spent quite a bit of time together. We did a little retail therapy at the stores in Germany, and about a year later, um, uh, I got a call from her. She had heard what had happened to me in Germany, how badly I had been treated, not by the Germans. You may think that for a Jew in Germany, that would be the issue. The Germans treated me beautifully. It was the Americans that treated me deplorably. She had heard about it, and she called me up, and we spoke for a little while, and she let me know how grateful she was for my support as she was, transitioning out of her job there in Germany and heading back home. Honestly, I don't think I did a whole lot other than um, listen and raise the issues that I thought needed to be raised to the officer in charge of the unit. I didn't burn anything down. I didn't get on a soapbox and decry, how she had been treated. But it was enormously kind, and I think that that is the kind of relationship that blacks and whites can have in this country if we'll open up our ears to each other and do our best to not just listen but really understand the point of view of the other. Um, have always believed and still believe to this day we have far more in common than we have that separates us. And so I on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I leave you with those thoughts. I thank you deeply for joining me, for listening to what I have to say. I would be very honored, and I don't use that term lightly, if you would ponder some of the thoughts that I've shared, and in particular, if you would ponder the words of the Reverend King. Maybe read them over again later today. Share them with somebody that you know who you think would benefit from hearing them. Share them with your children. Please share them with your children. Um, uh, Children don't grow up prejudice. Children are taught to be bigots, and we have a responsibility. We as adults have a responsibility to help them understand the proper way to live and look at things. So on this day especially, I'm I don't give the background as to who Marie is very often, but I think it's relevant today, lest there be some misunderstanding. So Marie is a very dear friend of mine. She lived her entire life in Alabama. She was born, I believe, in the same year as Martin Luther King Jr. And she lived through segregation. She lived through the injustices that were done with blacks. And she was a white woman, and she lived through the transformation that white Southerners made throughout that era. And she came to see the evil that was segregation and racial injustice, or injustice to blacks, and so it's one of the things about her that I find most admirable. It's very easy to have mistaken ideas. It's far harder to change them. And my dear friend Marie, who I got to take care of during the last year of her life, she exemplifies to me the ability of all of us to change our views, to change our minds, and to one person at a time create a better world. And so it's in recognition of the relationship we had, and how much I admire her, that I always sign off my shows by saying, Marie, darling, you are my belle. You're my Southern belle, because at one point when we were meeting, Marie let me know that I was her beau, but not in any weird way. that was a direct quote. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. Courage at all times, my friends.